Let's talk about the furry comic Miss Cockroach. Standing at a petite 100 pages or so, it's probably one of the more uniquely premised comics I've ever come across. This is an audience participation, choose your own adventure, post-apocalyptic story. We start the party with a bang as a mushroom cloud from an unknown source wipes out everything in a city, including the people. Amongst the wreckage emerges a lone survivor, main character, Miss Cockroach. Now, I don't know if the cockroaches survive nuclear blasts thing is a true or a myth. I'm not an expert, but hey, that's one way to keep the cast of your comic relatively small. The moment Miss Cockroach emerges from the wreckage, we, the audience, are immediately given the choice. Look for survivors, escape the city, or look for supplies to survive. I can tell that the original vote here thing has been replaced since it was made in 2023 with the final poll results. Looks like the audience wanted Miss Cockroach to seek out supplies, and that is a really ugly graph, I'm just saying. I also noticed that it has almost 70 votes on it. This made me scratch my head, so I did a little digging. A comic that's just starting out and has no audience yet surely can't draw that many votes right out of the gate. Choose Your Own Adventure is pretty popular, but 70 people don't stumble over a comic as soon as someone hits the publish button. Turns out the artist behind the comic is rather popular as a traditional physical artist and was only getting into doing digital art, using this comic to learn all the functions of their brand new tablet. Thusly, the unpolished and kind of cartoony look here. That's interesting, I like it. So they pulled their audience to look at this project and help steer it around. That's actually pretty cool. Anyway, Miss Cockroach is not alone in the wreckage of the city. As the sun begins to go down, gigantic owls swoop in from precisely nowhere and start picking through the wreckage to look for survivors to eat. Owls are fantastical creatures, much like dragons in this world, so of course she tries to hide from them to absolutely no effect. I kind of like how the comic treats owls like me, like these otherworldly beings. They're depicted like shadows wearing big white masks to show where their faces are. I'm reminded a bit of No Face from Spirited Away or the Hollows from Bleach. It's a neat design. I like it. Owls can be kind of creepy if we're not careful with our big eyes. I understand. But seeing them portrayed as these big monsters that are eating everything that survived the blast does make them pretty intimidating, and it kind of gives credence to the idea that the mushroom cloud was probably not a nuclear bomb, but rather something else. Now, I'm not a scientist, so I can only offer conjecture based on a narrative sense, but a massive release of heat and energy does cause mushroom clouds to form, not just nuclear bombs. So whoever or whatever did this obviously wanted there to be survivors in this nightmarish landscape, otherwise the owls would have nothing to pick up other than hopelessly irradiated skeletons. Moving on. As you might imagine, eventually Miss Cockroach does leave the ruined city and finds that the city itself was the only thing directly affected by the blast. The surrounding countryside seems relatively okay if abandoned. The campground and nature reserve, Bernheim Forest, is completely untouched. Making her way there on foot, since there are no vehicles to take, she finds a forest ranger's fire tower and takes up residence in it, since it has supplies, a radio, and puts a roof over her head. Since the monster owls only come out at night, all she has to do is close the blinds and turn the lights off, and she's relatively safe. The radio is dead, but the generator is solar powered, so she definitely lucked out in finding this place. There's no sign of other people communicating, but maybe there's a park ranger out there somewhere that's yet to come back. Like I said, there's only 100 pages on this one, so I won't go into too much more plot detail. The final cast count is like 4 people out in the woods somewhere while the fallout of whatever happened happens. A city girl getting thrust into a nature reserve is always an interesting premise. She has to learn to live off the land, find food, get along with the other people who just happened to be out there while the world was ending. It's pretty interesting. I can tell a lot of love and care went into the world building on this one. And when things got a little too particular, on a whim, I just Googled Bernheim Forest and found out that it's actually a real place. It's in Kentucky, USA. It's 16,000 acres of forest. The closest big city to Bernheim Forest is Louisville, which means that Miss Cockroach would have traveled something to the tune of 27 miles on her trek to safety. That's actually pretty reasonable. You could do that in a few days with a backpack of supplies, even if you were a city dweller that's not used to long-distance walking. I appreciate the nod to realism. The audience can steer the comic every 10 pages or so, and thus far they seem to be doing a good job. I think it's actually very wise that the votes are multiple choice and not suggestion-based. Knowing the furry fandom, it would either get real inappropriate or real horny real quick if they were getting free reign. And yeah, there's a spot of nudity here and there in the comic, but nothing super exciting. Just enough to give it the R rating that I can't show here, obviously. The end of the world has seemingly come, and it's up to Miss Cockroach and her little group of new friends to survive. Can they do it? I guess the audience will decide. I'm looking forward to see where this comic goes. It's really an interesting premise. So, all that being said, should you read Miss Cockroach? I would say yes, but you're probably going to have some trouble finding this one, as it doesn't have its own website, and it's not hosted on Fur Affinity or Webtoons or any of the other usual furry hangout spots. In fact, I have to go ahead and say, this comic isn't real. It doesn't exist. I made it up. April Fools.